This episode was suggested by a listener, my brother-in-law, James. Asylums have been requested by more people than I can remember, so I hope this snippet about asylums in Australia will hold you until I do an episode on asylums in general. I also forgot to mention that the last episode on teratomas was also suggested by Elliot on Instagram. Thanks, Elliot. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. This episode contains discussions of early methods thought to treat people suffering from mental illness and intellectually disabled people. Many of these methods are modernly considered cruel and may be difficult to hear about. The topics of institutionalization and suicide are also discussed after the ad break. If this isn't something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Also, the themes touched upon in this episode are complex. Elements that might not have been contentious then are now. Therefore, discussing them and forming conclusions involves a level of objectivity, which can be hard to achieve from a modern perspective. Please keep these difficulties in mind. And now, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. When we hear the phrase mental institution, the images that come to most of our minds are widely fed by television and movies. There are two main versions that are used in the popular media. One is a white-halled hospital-like building full of patients in white uniforms being given pills in small cups by nurses in white uniforms. It's quiet, bright, and monotonous. The other version is a decrepit, dark building full of malnourished people, screaming and crying while restrained in straitjackets or undergoing some type of horrible procedure by crazed doctors covered in gore. The first image represents what the media imagines life was like in the mental institutions of the not-so-distant past. The second represents what we think the institutions of the far-distant past were like. What the media does not often explore is the fact that both these versions of the mental institution have some truth to them, and that neither version is that far back in human history. The image we get from real historical documents that pertain to mental institutions of the late 1800s and early 1900s, then called asylums, is a mix of these two representations. But the further back we look, the more bleak and miserable the image becomes. In this episode, I'm going to use some terminology that was used in these historical documents. Terms like lunatic and mad were used to describe people with a variety of mental illnesses, while terms like idiot were used to describe people with any sort of intellectual disability. By using these terms, I hope to demonstrate the struggles of those suffering from these conditions to find a place in society during the time frame covered in this episode. It's been a hard road for mental illness to be as accepted as it is today. While asylums were found throughout the world, I'm going to focus on those that were established in the state of Victoria in Australia. Colonization of Australia by Western society occurred quite late when compared to colonization around the rest of the world, and therefore the first asylums in Victoria were set up during a time of massive change and advancement in the field of psychiatry. I also wanted to focus on asylums in Victoria because I currently live here, and most of these infamous asylums exist not far away from me. Locally, Ararat or Airedale Mental Hospital is famous for its ghost tours and also its reputation for a checkered past. Human habitation of Australia is thought to have begun around 65,000 to 70,000 years ago with the migration of the first people to the continent by land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. Aboriginal culture in Australia is one of the oldest continual civilizations on Earth. At the time of the first European contact, which occurred in 1606 with the Dutch, most of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were hunter-gatherers with complex economies and societies. Recent archaeological finds suggest that a population of 750,000 could have been sustained if colonization had not occurred. But colonization did occur, and as with most colonizations, the indigenous peoples suffered. The peoples of the Aboriginal population, estimated to number around 1 million in 1788, declined following settlement, mainly due to infectious diseases brought over by colonists. Thousands more died as a result of frontier conflict with the settlers. A third reason for the decline of the population of the Aboriginal peoples was the government policy of assimilation, beginning in 1869, which mandated the removal of many children of Aboriginal peoples from their families and communities. These children are often referred to as the stolen generations. Reparations are still owed and being made today in Australia, but that is a topic for another podcast. British colonists arrived on the eastern side of the continent in what is now known as New South Wales on January 24, 1788. This first arrival of ships is called the First Fleet. The first colonial settlers were relocated criminals and other people who were deemed undesirable by the English crown. This included many people who were then classified as mad, lunatic, idiot, or insane by those in power. The colonial population grew steadily, and thanks to a gold rush, by the 1850s, most of the continent had been explored, and 5 other self-governing crown colonies were established. On January 1, 1901, the 6 colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. The first European settlement in Victoria, which is located on the southeastern coast of Australia, right across from the island of Tasmania, was established in 1803. The area was named after Queen Victoria of England and was officially an independent territory in 1851. The Victorian gold rush in the 1850s and 1860s significantly increased the colonial population and wealth of the colony. By 1901, when all the territories united, Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria, had become the largest and most prosperous city in Australia. Throughout England's colonial history and before, madness and later the asylum were present on the boundaries of society. Asylums, or similar institutions, have existed for much longer than is commonly known. The very first asylum was established in Baghdad in 792 CE. Under Islam, the mentally ill were considered incapable, but still deserving of humane treatment and protection. Meanwhile, in Europe, mental illness was seen as a punishment from God, or due to possession by demons or witchcraft. Those with mental illness and intellectual disabilities were cared for by their families. Cared for isn't really the right phrase, as this care mostly consisted of restraint, confinement, and often abuse. Because insanity was thought to be a punishment or curse, there was social stigma and shame associated with it. Therefore, worried the affected family member would bring this stigma down on them as well, families often hid away their mentally ill members or abandoned them. Supposed treatments enacted by family members for madness included beating, cold baths, bitter tinctures, being tied up with ropes and confined to a small space. Bleeding and vomiting were also thought to help. Those that were abandoned were often found wandering the streets and brought to workhouses or general hospitals, which weren't much better. There were some private madhouses run by the clergy, but these were few and far between. The first public asylum in England was Bethlehem Hospital. which opened in London in 1247 near Bishopsgate. Bethlehem was colloquially shortened to Bethlem and then to Bedlam, a word that is now used as a synonym for chaos. Chaos is probably the word that best describes what it was like in this institution. The goal at the time was custodial. The mad, who were deemed trouble and couldn't be safely managed at home, were sent to Bethlehem and isolated from society. The conditions inside the asylum were horrific, and those held there suffered from starvation, dire hygiene, restraint with chains, and often display to the paying public, similar to a freak show. Once a person was admitted into Bedlam, there was little hope of getting out. Only the poor and destitute were sent to Bethlehem, however. The rich could afford to isolate their mad at home, or send them away to private madhouses run by the clergy or alienists, doctors who only treated people with mental illness. These alienists would later play a huge role in establishing the asylum system of treatment. The madness of the rich has been well represented in popular media. Famous books that have recently been turned into television programs that show these situations are Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, and The Alienist by Caleb Carr. Until the early 1800s, mental illness was not considered a medical condition. It was often thought that the full moon incited madness, hence the term lunatic and lunacy came into use as an alternative to madness. It was thought to be incurable. However, in the 1800s, medical professionals became interested in mental illness and began to see it not as a curse, but a disease of the mind that could possibly be cured. The rise of psychiatry led to the development of real treatments for mental illness. However, there was still a long road ahead before the development of modern medical treatments and mental health services. Many of the 750 convicts who arrived in Australia with the First Fleet in 1788 suffered from mental illness. As the colony was a prison settlement, there wasn't much distinction made between criminals and people with mental illness or intellectual disabilities. All those classified as criminals, idiots, and lunatics were housed at the town jail. The first mental asylum was established by 1811 at Castle Hill in New South Wales. Many more asylums were established after this, and the first one built in Victoria in 1848 was Yarra Bend Asylum in Melbourne. In fact, locals referred to those who were committed to Yarra Bend as having gone round the bend. It's possible that this is where that colloquialism for mental illness originates. In 1843, the Dangerous Lunatics Act was passed in Victoria and stated that asylums and those housed in them required medical staff and that all such institutions should be government-run and funded. This seems like a giant step forward. However, just 10 years later, a government inquiry revealed massive abuses taking place in these facilities, such as violence, corruption, and horrifically unhygienic conditions. Overcrowding had also left many inmates vulnerable to disease. In the mid-1800s, the moral movement began, in which medical professionals, especially in the field of psychiatry, began to propose humane treatment of the insane was the best way to treat their conditions. Several institutions were built in Victoria in the 1860s to provide this moral treatment. The idea was that fresh air, outdoor spaces, work, and activities were the best way to help those with mental illness, who were still referred to as lunatics at this time. Ararat Lunatic Asylum was finished in 1867, and it was palatial compared to the asylums that had come before it. The main building was a 2-story E-shaped structure with one wing for males and another for females. The design was based on an English asylum at Colney Hatch, now known as Princess Park Manor. Ararat Lunatic Asylum was built in the Italianate style, with linking bridges between the wings of the second floors and courtyards surrounding the structure. Altogether, the complex contained over 63 buildings and was staffed by around 500 people, most of them untrained attendants, but there were also several medical professionals. This town within a town, complete with farmlands, gardens, and even a cricket pitch, was surrounded by a wall that both patients and non-patients could see over. It was a special type of wall called a ha-ha wall, which due to landscaping seemed short and scalable from far off. But due to a deep trench at its base, a trench that only exists on the asylum side of the wall, was actually very tall and difficult to scale. Several other asylums were built around this time and considered sister facilities to Ararat. These were the Kew and Beechworth asylums. Even though these asylums were meant to focus on moral treatment, overcrowding and a lack of funding meant these asylums were soon understaffed, and much of the old methods of isolation and restraint came back into use. Kew Asylum quickly grew a reputation for being the worst run and most deplorable asylum in Victoria, but I'll get to that after the break. Outside the asylum, psychiatric theories on the causation of madness were beginning to gather momentum at the turn of the century, and the idea that trauma could cause mental illness and treatment through therapy could cure it were revolutionizing the psychological world. In 1903, another Lunacy Act was passed, holding up the idea that lunacy was a medical condition that could indeed be treated, and that these lunatic asylums should be renamed Hospitals of the Insane in support of this. Unfortunately, despite the name change, there was little change in the quality of care. Overcrowding, understaffing, and a lack of funding was still an issue, especially in the larger asylums, as they required constant maintenance of both the buildings and the grounds. World War I had a large impact on the mental health services. Most males left for war, depleting the workforce. When the war was over, the need for both physical and psychological nursing skyrocketed, thanks to war injuries, a multitude of venereal diseases, and shell shock, which we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. However, as mental health nursing was not well paid, lacked benefits, and was a tough working environment, it didn't draw much of a workforce back into the mental hospitals after the war. So between World War I and World War II, the facilities fell further into disrepair, and conditions became very poor. In the 1920s, the rise of somatic treatment theory brought new treatments to the hospitals for the insane, not all of them helpful. These treatments included electroconvulsive therapy, induced malaria fevers, insulin-induced comas, lobotomy, drug-induced sleep therapy, and hydrotherapy, or cold baths. While some of these treatments, such as ECT, could actually improve some severe cases of depression, many of the treatments, including ECT, were misused to subdue patients, turning them into triggers instead of treatments. The Mental Hygiene Act of 1933 again tried to raise the standards of the mental health services and changed the names of these institutions once again from hospitals for the insane to mental hospitals. Those admitted were now referred to as patients instead of inmates. However, the day-to-day operation of these facilities still remained poor. They were still overcrowded, mismanaged, dehumanizing, and filthy. The patients that were quiet and calm were now kept separate and lived a life of monotonous chores, while the more active and violent patients were kept together, and restraints were still commonly used to maintain order. As you can see, while the governmental acts and the medical professionals of the time endorsed the moral treatment of patients, due to a lack of medical understanding, a lack of attendant training, and a lack of funds, the mental hospitals of the late 1800s and early 1900s were unfortunately not much different from their medieval counterparts. Before we get into the details of the day-to-day activities within these asylums, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed and being entered in a monthly raffle. When you become a patron, it helps us keep this show going. If more people become patrons, we may even be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no break in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you'll be directed to our Patreon page, where you can choose your rewards. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. As I mentioned before the break, I want to get into the specifics on the mental institutions of Victoria at the turn of the century. This includes what qualifies as insane, the conditions in the hospital, the people that staffed it, and the treatments used on the patients. Some may find this information distressing, so use your discretion to decide if you want to continue listening. People who were considered by friends and family to be lunatics could be committed to one of these asylums in a number of ways. A friend, relative, or acquaintance could recommend sending a person to the asylum as long as they had medical certificates written and signed by 2 medical practitioners. Anyone found wandering about displaying symptoms of lunacy or found not to be under the proper care and control by their family could be brought before 2 justices who could order the person's removal to an asylum. In this case, the person was usually picked up by police while on duty. Prisoners thought by their jailers to be lunatics could be moved from the jail to an asylum by order of the chief secretary of the prison. In all of these cases, it only took 2 signatures to place a person in the asylum. In 1915, it was made legal for people to voluntarily place themselves in an asylum for a period of time, and then check themselves out. These inmates paid for their stay, which meant they were often kept in the better maintained parts of the asylum, such as the quiet wards. In order to be discharged from an asylum, 8 signatures from medical practitioners, asylum staff, and family members were required. Because of this, once a person was in an asylum, it was very hard to get back out. The signs and symptoms of what was considered lunacy were varied. Some of the symptoms are still legitimate indicators of mental illness today, illnesses such as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. These illnesses were of course not classified into these categories at the time, but instead into mania, melancholia, dementia, and paranoia. While some of the indicators and symptoms were legitimate, there were other behaviors and conditions that modernly we don't consider mental illness, but at the time caused people to be taken to asylums as lunatics. One of these conditions was epilepsy. The seizures were thought to be a sign of insanity, so many epileptics were sent off to asylums for care, despite being sound of mind and perfectly healthy otherwise. Another condition that got many people sent to the asylum was late-stage or tertiary syphilis. At this stage, the disease affects the brain and spinal cord, which breaks down the infected person's mental capabilities and motor control. The person also remains very sick, so many were sent to regular hospitals, who then passed them off to asylums for erratic behavior that the illness brought on. Other things that could get a person admitted to an asylum was alcoholism, masturbation, and intellectual disabilities. Women were thought to suffer from a condition known as hysteria. Hysteria was a blanket diagnosis for several symptoms, including anxiety, depression, mania, insomnia, irritability, loss of appetite, bloating, and sexually forward behavior. It was also applied to women who didn't want to have sex, women who became angry, and women who, quote, had a tendency to cause trouble. In extreme cases, these women would be forced to enter an asylum or undergo a hysterectomy, meaning their uterus was surgically removed. Some of the symptoms of this blanket condition are still considered forms of mental illness, such as postnatal depression, which is now treatable through therapy and medication. However, most of the symptoms of hysteria were just behaviors that women were not expected to exhibit or have in the male-dominated society of the time. If a woman constantly rejected those expectations, she was considered hysterical or insane. Again, for a long time it only took 2 signatures to have a misbehaving woman sent to an asylum for the rest of her life. I'd love to do a full episode on hysteria, so let me know if you'd be interested. It's possible that differences in culture had an effect on the diagnosis of lunacy in Aboriginal peoples. There was potential for the signs of mental illness displayed by Aboriginal peoples to be dismissed by Western doctors lacking understanding of their culture. However, it appears that Aboriginal peoples were also recommended to the asylum in order to remove them from conflicts with Westerners. Either way, diagnosis of mental illness among Aboriginal peoples was handled differently than it was among white populations. Whether there was an institutional bias or strategy when dealing with Aboriginal peoples is not necessarily clear. Conditions in these asylums during the turn of the century varied, but as I mentioned, most of the asylums suffered from overcrowding. As these institutions were government-run, they depended on the government for funding. They were also huge and required a lot of attention just to keep their doors open. Therefore, the lack of funding led to the grounds falling into disrepair first, and then the buildings, as things broke or wore out and were not replaced. Staff were also less likely to be fired, as it was hard to find people who would work for such low wages in such difficult conditions. This meant insubordinate staff were kept on despite their infractions, making the environment tense for the patients and the medical staff. The day-to-day activities at the asylum were kept on a tight schedule. Inmates got up at a certain time, and the lights went out at a certain time every day. Daily activities included occupations, such as farming and sports for men, and sewing and laundry for women. Sometimes there would be organized activities like concerts or other performances, but even these entertainments were mandatory. Bathing, too, was mandatory and occurred once a week, often with 10 to 15 inmates using the same water, thanks to the lack of funding. If someone refused their bath, they were forced to take it anyway. Hygiene in general was lacking, and when toilets broke down, they were often not repaired for an extended period. Water was and is an important commodity in the Australian summer, and sometimes the whole asylum was without water for days during the summer due to shortages. 3 meals were eaten every day, and were usually pretty substantial, but mealtimes were tense, as these were the times when all the inmates in each separate wing were in one location. This crowding into one room often brought out people's symptoms, and attendants were constantly stopping fights and often issuing punishments. The punishments harkened back to the medieval treatment of the mentally ill. They often consisted of restraint of either the whole body in a straitjacket or restraining the hands and feet. Some people were put into isolation rooms or given cold baths. The worst punishments were issued at Kew Asylum, which was exposed through multiple inquiries to be the roughest of the large Victorian asylums. Cold bath punishments often resulted in near drownings, and heavy beatings were used to subdue patients long after they were outlawed. Violence was seen as necessary by the attendants to maintain order. The size of the institutions and the nature of some of the occupants, coupled with an almost obsessive concern with keeping to a schedule, made the situation almost unavoidably inflammatory. While violent methods of control were discouraged, some force was permitted, and turning a blind eye was a common occurrence. After restraints were outlawed, sedatives became heavily relied upon to keep order. It's not known if the constant violence reported at Kew was also endured at Ararat, but it's very likely that it was, if only to a lesser extent. While there are reports of good treatment and actual recovery from Ararat and Beechworth, there were also several inquiries after complaints were lodged by the inmates, their families, and the medical staff. In 1886, the Ararat County Jail was absorbed by the Ararat Asylum and named J Ward. This was a male-only ward which housed the criminally insane, those patients with violent tendencies who were considered a danger to others and themselves. This ward was supposed to be a temporary solution until a new institution for the criminally insane was built at Sunbury. However, when the institution at Sunbury was completed, only women were housed there, and J Ward became a permanent ward of the Ararat Asylum. The prisons of Victoria often sent their most violent criminals to J Ward, and it's very likely they were kept under control by force. The rates of suicide in these institutions was surprisingly low, but this is because most of the inmates' attempts at taking their own lives occurred when they were allowed out of the asylum on leave to visit their families. This type of leave privilege was often only allowed to well-behaved inmates. Escape attempts weren't uncommon, and usually the escapee was found and returned to the asylum they fled. It's not known if there were any consequences for these attempts, but my guess is there were. The quiet, well-behaved inmates are often recorded as being well-treated. Their time was monotonous, and they often felt neglected, but they weren't subjected to the same chaotic environment that the more boisterous inmates were. There are several thank you letters from patients to medical staff at Ararat and Beechworth for their kindness. These letters, however, are few in comparison to the stories of violence and neglect. In 1883, a woman named Matilda Cutler was released from Ararat on probation. She had originally been committed for being excitable and hysterical. She told her husband Joseph stories of her time at Ararat and the horrific abuse suffered by the inmates. She told of beatings, whippings, force feedings, sickness, death, and sexual abuse. She also told Joseph of the squalor the inmates lived in. Horrified, Joseph wrote to the inspector of lunatic asylums for the state of Victoria with his concerns. The inspector wrote back that Matilda's doctors had said she was violent, destructive, and not to be believed. Joseph, however, believed his wife and got the newspapers involved. The papers followed the story and began promoting the rights of asylum inmates. The Cutlers accused the staff at Ararat of cruelty, habitual drunkenness, and assault. Sedatives and beatings were said to be issued at the drop of a hat to any patient who questioned authority. After the Cutlers spoke out, similar accusations arose from inmates and the families of inmates at Kew. The public cried out for an investigation, and in 1884 there was an official inquiry. The truth of Matilda's claims was revealed. The attendants were fired and replaced, and the master of the lunacy department was removed. Unfortunately, Matilda was returned to Ararat in 1896. She died there in 1903. Her bravery in challenging the government to inquire into its asylums caught the public's attention, and in later years other inquiries were made, many of which I've mentioned. These inquiries did their best to support the vulnerable people committed to these asylums and protect them from an often neglected, often corrupted system. While we often feel pity for the patients, we forget the plight of the attendants. In the earliest jails in Australia, it was other prisoners that volunteered to care for the lunatics, because by doing so, they were given softer sentences or extra privileges. The first mention of hired nurses, or what were then known as lunatic attendants, came from documents that pertained to Yarra Bend Asylum. At first, these attendants were called keepers or wardens, but this changed to lunatic attendants in 1849. These attendants were often hired solely on their size and strength, and were found by an 1852 inquiry to function basically as prison wardens and janitors. They were not trained to care for people, let alone mentally ill people. Their pay was negligible, and the working conditions were very difficult. For these reasons, only the most desperate individuals took these positions. At this time, the attendants also lived at the asylum and, like the inmates, seldom left. In 1867, it was recorded that attendants worked 6 days a week and 13 hours a day. They were basically confined to the asylum along with the inmates, and were often on call during the night and on their days off. While none of this excuses the abusive and cruel behavior toward their charges, you can see that conditions for attendants weren't much better than they were for inmates. Attendants remained untrained until 1887, when moral treatment lectures began to be given at Kew Asylum. This was not a regimented training course, however, and old habits were hard to quell. The push for real training came from the medical staff at the asylums, who witnessed the hardships of both patients and attendants. In 1890, trained nurses were appointed to the staff at many asylums, and a more formalized practical instruction for attendants emerged, but this training didn't become compulsory until 1894. The efforts to establish trained nurses as attendants were undermined by the fact that mental health nursing was not considered a real medical profession at the time. In 1906, after the Lunacy Act of 1903 established that mental illness was a medical condition that could be cured, the rules and regulations for nursing staff at mental hospitals were created, and exams after the first year of attending became a requirement in order to progress to the next level of employment. However, the day-to-day duties still remained relatively unchanged from the beginning of asylum history: maintain order, clean, and repeat. This only changed in the 1950s. After World War II, a massive investigation into the conditions of Victorian mental health services was conducted due to a growing number of reports of abuse. Now known as the Kennedy Report, the inquiry revealed the extent of corruption, abuse, and mismanagement at these institutions. The Mental Hygiene Act of 1950 raised the standards of mental hospitals and mental health nursing. This brought the level of care and hygiene up to the same standards as regular hospitals. Also, the introduction of antipsychotic drugs in the 1950s brought real treatment options for many conditions and changed mental health care all over the world for the better. There was finally a growing hope for curing mental illness. Female and male patients were integrated for the first time, making the environment more normal and less prison-like. Occupational therapy was re-established and eased patients back into everyday routines. The average length of patient stays grew smaller and smaller, and there were fewer and fewer reports of violence against patients. In 1966, parts of the Ararat Mental Hospital became Ararat Training Center, which catered specifically to people with intellectual disabilities. These patients were reclassified as trainees, while those at the mental hospital continued as patients. Ararat Mental Hospital, which was rechristened Airedale Mental Hospital in 1958, functioned as a mental hospital all the way up until 1991. Over this time, it continued to attempt to make things better for its patients and trainees. Despite their hard work, the mental hospital was still under inquiry several times for mismanagement. The hospital was doing well when it closed, and the community of Ararat was quite upset at the closure. But the mental hospital era was over, and smaller, more individual therapies were replacing these large facilities. Mental health services around the world are still evolving, as we are still discovering things about the brain and how it works. New medications and therapies have been introduced, even since the 90s. Mental illness is losing its stigma more and more every year. This brings great hope for those suffering from mental illness, but there's still a long way to go to provide safe facilities for the most vulnerable of our society. Today, you can visit a museum in J Ward of Airedale Mental Hospital. The rest of Airedale is now Melbourne Polytechnic, a training program for winemaking and hospitality. Kew, which was renamed Willsmere and closed in 1988, was mostly converted into a residential estate. A small museum is maintained in the old female-paying patients wing. Beechworth was also converted into some residential properties, but is mostly a tourist attraction, as the gardens and buildings are well maintained, and tours focusing on the heritage gardens and architecture are quite popular. The Chapel of the Resurrection, to the west of the site, was originally the mortuary for the asylum complex, but was converted to a chapel in the 1960s. It can now be booked for weddings. In February of 2018, hundreds of historical records from Victorian asylums were released by the Public Records Office of Victoria and digitized by the genealogical website Ancestry.com. If you already have a membership with Ancestry, you can read most of these documents from Ararat, Kew, Beechworth, and Yarra Bend asylums. Unfortunately, there's a paywall blocking free perusal of these digital case files, but most of them are available as physical copies at the State Library of Victoria, as well as the Public Records Office. The history of mental health facilities in Victoria and in the rest of the world is often difficult to hear about. A lack of understanding and a lack of real treatment options made the situation in these institutions volatile. The lack of interest and funding for these institutions made them filthy and decrepit. The slow evolution of mental health services has been a struggle from the beginning, and for the most part, the history of asylums shows us how very far we have come as humans in understanding and accepting mental illness. It's an era we have safely moved away from, but remains in the back of our minds, reminding us how far we have come, which is why asylums bring out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show @Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram @Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media, and please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Jordan, Matthew, Lisa, Tara, Sierra, Gemma, Jackie, Allie, Fernando, MX Kaira, Kim, Nikki, and Rosma. Jonathan, Imogen, Louisa, and Molly all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like some MCP merchandise, an enamel pin was created for the MCP by Rad Girl Creations. If you'd like a pin, go to bit.ly/morbidpin to get yours before we run out. That's bit.ly/morbidpin. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. On this list are items that will help us improve the podcast, improve our workspace, and some things that are just for fun. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.